Okay, just imagine for a second. You wake up, you grab your phone, and the first thing you see is that the United States is threatening to, I don't know, annex a huge piece of territory from a NATO ally.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like a suggestion. I mean threats of crushing tariffs, military force, the whole thing. Sounds like a movie plot.
Yeah.
Right? Some kind of alternative history novel.
It really does. It sounds like a scenario from a much, much darker timeline than the one we're usually in.
But just a few days ago, that was reality. The world was genuinely bracing for, well, a hostile takeover of Greenland. We were looking at a shattered NATO alliance, a trade war that would have just wrecked the global economy.
And then what?
And then today, silence, a complete and sudden retreat.
It's honestly one of the most fascinating cases of diplomatic whiplash I've seen in years. We went from invasion imminent to a vague diplomatic framework in, 48 hours?
Exactly. So how on earth did that happen? That is our mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking this clash between U.S. President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
And to do that, we're looking at a very detailed report and transcript from Canada today. It's crucial because it gives us that tick-tock of what was happening behind the scenes.
Right. The report's titled, Just In, Isolated Trump Attacks Canada After Carney's Historic Speech.
Mm.
And we're going to figure out the why. Because, on the surface, this just looks like another chaotic news cycle.
Yeah.
But if you look closely at the source material, it's a masterclass in calling a bluff.
It really is.
It's about how a single speech reportedly dismantled a whole pressure campaign and might have just rewritten the playbook for how, middle powers deal with superpowers.
It poses a huge question. Is the era of might makes right over? Or did Canada just get really lucky here?
I still can't wrap my head around the timeline. I mean, we went from troop threats to everything's fine so fast. But let's rewind. Let's look at the Greenland ultimatum. Because this wasn't just some real estate inquiry, was it?
No, absolutely not. And that's the context we have to start with. The Canada Today report is crystal clear on this.
Yeah.
This was not a business deal. Before the Davos summit, the situation had escalated way beyond a simple purchase offer. Trump was actively threatening European countries with punitive tariffs unless Greenland was handed over.
Yeah, the report says he was openly talking about force. That's a terrifying phrase when you're talking about the Arctic. It's not just buying an island, it's changing the map.
It is. And the strategy that the report identifies is pretty stark. The source basically describes Trump's whole approach as threaten tariffs, scare your allies, talk about force, and then just wait for everyone to blink.
It's the madman theory of negotiation.
Exactly.
Make yourself look just crazy enough to actually do it so everyone else folds just to keep the peace.
Precisely. And usually people blink. They do, because the stakes are just so high. I mean, Trump was framing sovereignty as optional.
Wow.
Think about what that means for a moment. He wasn't just saying, I want this island. He was implying that borders and, national ownership are negotiable if you're big enough.
That's an existential threat to NATO.
Yeah.
I mean, for anyone listening who isn't a policy wonk, NATO runs on Article 5, the whole, an attack on one is an attack on all.
Right.
That relies on borders being real, tangible things. If borders are just suggestions, the whole alliance is just a piece of paper, isn't it?
That's the core of the crisis. This wasn't some trade dispute. It was a fundamental challenge to the international order. If the U.S. can force a sale of territory from an ally, the alliance is, for all intents and purposes, dead.
So Denmark protested, obviously. Europe pushed back.
Of course. But the source highlights something really specific here. It says that while everyone was worried, it was Canada, led by Mark Carney, that stepped forward publicly, clearly, and without hesitation.
Which is interesting because usually Canada's the polite neighbor, right?
Mm-hmm.
The mediator. But okay, this brings us to the main event, Davos, the World Economic Forum.
The scene of the crimes, so to speak.
Right. You've got the snow, the expensive hot chocolate, the private jets, and all the world's elite rubbing elbows. And usually, this is where polite, kind of boring speeches happen.
It's a venue for platitudes. We need to work together, synergy, all that sort of thing. Leaders generally avoid any direct confrontation there because they just don't want to rock the boat.
Especially with the U.S. president in the room.
Especially then. But Carney, well, he either didn't get that memo or he just burned it.
Yeah.
The source really emphasizes that Carney did the exact opposite of what leaders usually do. Most leaders, when Trump threatens something, they try to negotiate behind closed doors. They offer some kind of concession, buy more American dairy just to make the problem go away.
The appeasement route.
Yeah.
Keep the giant happy so he doesn't step on your house.
Sort of, yes. Or at least conflict avoidance. But Carney went on that stage and used vocabulary that you just don't hear in diplomatic circles.
He didn't say it was a misunderstanding. He didn't call it tough negotiating.
No, he called it economic blackmail and coercion.
Those are heavy words. You really can't walk those back.
They're radioactive words. And that's exactly why it worked. The source explains the psychology here brilliantly. Trump's power, in a lot of ways, it relies on ambiguity. He creates this gray area where he's pressuring you, but he can always claim he's just making a deal.
Right, like, I'm not threatening you. I'm just saying it would be a shame if your entire economy collapsed. It's the mob boss tactic.
Exactly. It relies on everyone playing along with this fiction that this is normal diplomacy. But by naming the behavior, by calling it blackmail in front of the world's most powerful leaders in the global media, Carney just destroyed that shield of ambiguity. He turned the lights on.
And cockroaches hate the light.
Well, specifically, it removes his exit ramp. You can't publicly negotiate with blackmail without looking weak. Carney asserted that sovereignty is not negotiable. He just drew a line in the sand.
So if Trump kept pushing?
If he kept pushing after being called out like that, he wouldn't be making a deal anymore. He'd be openly admitting to challenging NATO and Arctic security.
So Carney basically forced him to choose. Either admit you're the villain or back down.
Correct. He raised the cost of the behavior.
Yeah.
And you have to consider Carney's background for a second. The report doesn't really dwell on it, but remember, he's a former central banker. Bank of Canada, Bank of England.
That's true. He's a numbers guy. He deals in risk assessment.
That's his whole world. He's not a populist politician. He's a technocrat. And when a guy like that calls you reckless, it hits differently than if another politician does it. It sounds like a credit rating downgrade.
It strips the glamour away from the whole Trump brand. It's not bold leadership. It's just bad risk management.
And we know Trump hates being isolated, which brings us to the reaction. Because Trump was at Davos, too. He heard this, and the description of his reaction in the report is, well, it's classic.
It paints a picture of a man who is genuinely rattled.
So instead of coming out with some kind of policy response, the source says Trump spent an hour just praising himself, listing his achievements.
Right.
And then he pivots and just lashes out at Canada.
I have to read the quote because it is just wild. He said, "We're building a golden dome. Canada lives because of the United States. Remember that, Mark, the next time you make your statements."
Canada lives because of the United States.
It's so aggressive. It sounds like a line from a movie. Nice country you got there. Shame if something happened to it. But what is this golden dome?
He's probably referring to missile defense or maybe some kind of metaphorical economic shield. But the specificity doesn't really matter as much as the sentiment. It sounds aggressive, but if we analyze it through the lens of the source material, this wasn't a show of strength. It was anxiety.
Anxiety disguised as toughness.
Precisely. The expert in the report notes that this was a reaction to a speech that landed harder than he expected. Trump wasn't arguing the merits of the Greenland deal anymore. He was just complaining that Canada wasn't grateful.
Grateful, like he's a landlord and Canada's late on rent.
It's an emotional response, not a strategic one. He singled out Mark Carney by name. That shows he was personally stung. He felt cornered. I mean, when a leader starts saying, "You only exist because I let you," they're not negotiating from a position of confidence.
No.
They're lashing out because their previous leverage, that ambiguity, is just gone.
And what about the reaction back home in Canada? The report talks about the man on the street perspective. Usually, Canadians get pretty nervous when the U.S. president is mad at them. I mean, they're like 90% of their trade or something huge.
It was a complex mix. The source describes it as existential dread mixed with pride.
That makes sense. It's scary to have the elephant next door threaten to roll over on you, but it feels good to see your leader finally stand up.
The phrase they used was an elbows up moment.
Elbows up.
Yes.
I love that. It's very hockey.
It is very fitting. In hockey, you go into the corners, you keep your elbows up to protect your space. It's not attacking, but it's refusing to be moved. There's this sense that Canadians felt this was the speech they needed to hear. It wasn't just about Greenland. It was about refusing to be bullied.
Okay, so we've got the ultimatum, the speech, the lashing out. But the million-dollar question is, did it work? Did the elbows up strategy actually stop the tanks? Did Trump invade?
The answer is a hard no.
No paratroopers and nuke.
No. After meeting with the NATO Secretary General, Trump rushed to social media. And this is where the Greenland gambit officially failed. He announced a framework.
A framework? That sounds so bureaucratic.
It sounds official, doesn't it? We have agreed to a framework. But when you look at the details provided in the source, there were no details.
Nothing.
No terms, no ownership transfer, no enforcement mechanisms, just a vague promise to pause tariffs.
So he got nothing.
He got absolutely nothing. In the world of diplomacy, a framework without any dates or dollars is just a fancy way of saying, we agreed to stop yelling at each other for a week.
Right.
The source describes this as Trump's oldest move. You create a crisis, you lose control of it when someone stands up to you, and then you just declare victory anyway by slapping a fancy name on the retreat.
The fake framework.
Essentially. I mean, if this was a real deal, Trump would have been bragging about the square footage he just acquired. He'd be talking about where the Trump Tower nuke is going to be built. Instead, he just backed away.
The verdict here seems pretty damning for him.
It is. The source argues he folded because he was cornered by credible leadership. He didn't get Greenland, and he didn't get compliance. He got resistance. And that resistance forced him to stop.
It's amazing to think that just saying no clearly enough can actually stop a superpower. But I guess that leads us to the bigger picture. Because this feels like a turning point.
It's absolutely a strategic shift. We are potentially looking at a new world order, or at least a new rule book for it.
The source mentions that Trump has effectively isolated himself. And this part is interesting. It says, Trump 2.0, optimism is gone.
Right. A year ago, there might have been this idea that a second term would be different, maybe more organized. But the source says the world now sees a sober-eyed reality of just dysfunction and disarray.
But here's the thing that I think makes this a real deep dive. It wasn't just the speech, was it? You can't just talk a bully down if you don't have something to back it up with.
No, you can't.
Carney has been busy doing other things.
And this is the part that is most critical for you to understand. This was not just a speech. It was backed by a strategy of diversification. The source calls it insurance.
Insurance against the U.S.
Insurance against reliance on the U.S. Carney hasn't just been making speeches. He's been strengthening ties with China. He's been deepening engagement with the European Union, expanding global partnership.
Wait, strengthening ties with China? That seems risky. The U.S. has to hate that.
It's incredibly risky. But look at it from Canada's perspective. If your biggest trading partner keeps threatening to destroy your economy every time they wake up on the wrong side of the bed, you have to find other customers.
So if Trump wakes up tomorrow and decides to put a 200% tariff on Canadian maple syrup,
Canada has other friends. Exactly. That's the consequence of this diversification. It reduces your vulnerability. The source explains that if Trump threatens Canada economically now, Canada is no longer isolated. They have options. They have other partners.
It's like diversifying your stock portfolio, but for national survival.
A perfect analogy. You don't put all your eggs in one very volatile basket. By building these alternatives, Carney made sure that his elbows up speech wasn't just bluster. It was backed by the reality that Canada could survive a fight.
But isn't there a danger there? I mean, if you pivot to China to avoid the U.S., aren't you just trading one problem for another? You're swapping the eagle for the dragon.
That is the tightrope. And the report acknowledges this. But in the immediate term, it gave Carney the leverage he needed. He could look Trump in the eye and say no, because he knew his country wouldn't collapse the next day. It's about leverage, not affection.
And that changes the balance of power.
Fundamentally. The source argues that this didn't just end the Greenland crisis. It proved that intimidation can be resisted. And more importantly, that resistance attracts allies. When Canada stood up, it aligned itself with Europe, with Denmark, with the whole NATO structure. It proved that you don't have to just take it.
Which is a huge lesson for everyone else watching.
It is. The source concludes that Trump's biggest mistake wasn't backing down on Greenland. His biggest mistake was showing the world that his threats can be neutralized.
Once you show the world that the emperor has no clothes, or at least that his threats are hollow, the fear factor just plummets.
Exactly. Every future bluff he makes now carries less weight. Whether it's against Europe or Japan or anyone else, they can look at the Greenland Gambit and say, well, Canada didn't fold. Why should we?
That is a powerful precedent. It's like the first kid in school who stands up to the bully. Suddenly everyone realizes the bully isn't 10 feet tall.
The report calls it one of the most damaging miscalculations of his career. He tried to redraw borders with threats, and instead he just taught the world how to defeat him.
Talk about a backfire. So let's bring it all together.
Yeah.
We started with a threat of annexation, a literal hostile takeover of a land mass.
A threat that was met not with quiet negotiation, but with a wall of solidarity.
Led by a Canadian refusal to be bullied. Mark Carney basically looked at the threat, called it what it was, blackmail, and watched the whole house of cards collapse into a fake framework.
And in doing so, he secured insurance for the future. He showed that sovereignty isn't optional and that middle powers can stand their ground if they're smart, united, and loud.
It's a pretty incredible story of diplomacy with the gloves off. But before we go, I want to leave you with a thought. Mark Carney drew a line and it held. He had the EU, he had the NATO charter, he had a diversified trade strategy in his back pocket. But sovereignty is not negotiable, right? That's the slogan.
That's the principle, yes.
So what happens when the next crisis involves a country that doesn't have Canada's web of alliances? What happens when the target is someone who can't call up the EU or leverage trade with China? Does the line hold then?
That is the uncomfortable question, isn't it? The method worked for Canada because Canada is Canada. But can it scale? Or will the next bully just pick a lonelier victim?
Something to think about. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us. See you next time.